name too long. I'm reminded of a poem by the late great Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, that former president of Morehouse College, that said, I only have just a minute, only 60 seconds in it. Didn't seek it, didn't choose it. Forced upon me, and I must not abuse it. But it's up to me to use it. I might suffer if I lose it. And I must not abuse it, for I only have just a tiny minute. But there, in that tiny minute, eternity is in it. When I thought about the theme of this particular program, and it was brought to me that the theme was going to be centered around one of the most important scriptures of the Bible, coming out of 1 Corinthians 14th chapter and 40th verse. Let all things be done decently and in order. So as I was sitting around thinking about what I would say to you on this morning, February 27, 2022, I thought about my grandmother, Elizabeth Hall Pons, who, aside from my mother, was my rock and my spiritual foundation. My grandmother, well, my mother passed away in 2017, and so she was always that mother figure. But that role stepped up within 2017 up until sadly 2020, when she passed away. At the same time, I was suffering from COVID-19. That was a difficult time in my life, and those difficult moments brought me back to what my grandmama used to always say, that a lot of times when you're going through your darkest hours, the Lord will come to you around midnight. And so as I was grieving her passing, at the same time trying to get well myself, something miraculously came into my spirit, and it said, it is well with my soul. Because I heard it so many times growing up. So as I prepared for this particular program, I'm reminded of being around my grandmother during my early days coming up in Panama City, Florida. See, my grandmama used to clean houses. My grandmama cleaned houses for about 5 different white families. But my grandmother could clean house so good that Michelangelo could never paint a better picture than my grandmother cleaned the house. My grandmother cleaned the house better than Beethoven could ever compose a song. So when I would be around my grandmother, she would instill the same things within me that we would have within our own house when we would have to clean up. And she would come behind me as I would be with her during the summer months. When I was out of school, if I wasn't here with relatives in Atlanta, Georgia, I would be with my grandmother working, and she would say, Jeremy, go do the bathroom while I do the kitchen, or do the bedroom and make the beds while I vacuum and dust. And I think this is one particular day, we were up early, and you know, coming up as a child, I already had to be up early to go to school. Right. So to get up early to clean somebody else's house that wasn't mine was not on the top of my agenda at the time. And I knew it wasn't on hers, but she had to help make a living with my family along with my grandfather. But I remember I kind of half did the bed that she assigned me to. And I really didn't know why she made such a big deal. I think I just did a quick tuck underneath the pillows, just tried to tuck the sheets just enough and tried to pat it down with pillows at the headboard of the bed to make it look presentable. But she came in the room, she said, baby, you did it all wrong. And when she came in, she pretty much really undid the cover. She did undo undid the sheets, undid the pillows. Baby, you got to do this the right way because this bed has to be done decent and in order. So see, Corinthians wasn't the only time where I heard that say. But it comes to another point of where we are today. While sitting at my grandmother's behest growing up, my grandmama grew up in a county called Jackson County, Florida. The county seat is called Marianna, which is maybe about 40-45 minutes north of Panama City and about maybe 20 miles south of Dothan, Alabama. My grandmother would sit there and tell me about the days when she, along with my great-grandmother, who I had the privilege of knowing until I was 10 years old, and her grandmother would have to sharecrop during the early to late 30s and the early 40s until she was able to finally graduate from high school. To sit down to give me that family structure of our history in our own immediate family, to show us where and how far we've had to come to get to where we are today. And as I was driving through this torrential rain this morning on the way here, and thought about, Lord, I wonder, is anybody going to be able to come out today because the roads were so slippery and the rain was so treacherous. But as I was going through that rain on the way here, I got motivated a little more because I started thinking about that old great boy, Lyndon James Weldon Johnson, who wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. And in one verse of that song, he says, we have come over a way that with tears have been watered. We have come, treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered, out of the gloomy path. Till now, we stand at last, where the bright gleam of our bright star is cast. So as I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about what me and my grandmother used to do back in the day, cleaning houses, and I think that's why I have OCD now when it comes to my own house, because I can't stand for my house to be dirty. So I just want to come with a simple message on this morning. It's time to get our American house in order. I reminded of a song from the 90s, and it was a gospel song that most choirs used to sing. Get your house in order, for he's coming back again. Get your house in order. Nobody knows where or when. Get your house in order, for he's coming back again. We've got a lot of work to do in 2022. We've been through enough already since we arrived on these shores in 1619, going through what I consider to be the worst Holocaust, not in American history, but world history. The transatlantic African slave trade, where many didn't make it on those ships to get over here. Some of those bodies are still lying at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean on that treacherous trek to America. And let's not forget that it was some of our own folk that sold us into this predicament. So let's be reminded that not all of your skin folk are kinfolk. So we need to keep a watch out on each other. But for some reason, from 1619 through the years and decades of slavery, lynchings, all the way up until the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, really in 1862, even though we didn't find out we were free until 1863. And then after that, there was a period that was known as Reconstruction. because America's house had been messed up so bad that our folk decided it was time to get it back in order. So that's when you saw the rise of individuals like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. We already know what Harriet Tubman did, freeing all those slaves, going back, making 300-something odd trips from Canada back to the United States on such a dangerous mission. But we want to think about those abolitionists that gave us free African Americans as source of hope that we didn't even really see, toiling in those fields of Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Florida, and Tennessee, and elsewhere. But during that time of Reconstruction, that's when you saw your first blacks elected to the United States House of Representatives and in the Senate, coming from Alabama and Mississippi. That's when you saw the rise in the beginning, around between 1865 and 1870, of what we consider to be most of our prestigious, historically black colleges. Originally designed to be land-grant colleges designed to teach our people how to farm and to make our own way, following our freedom, following the Emancipation Proclamation. That's when you started to see the FAMUs and the Morehouses and the Tuskegee Institutes and elsewhere that were training and developing our minds that had been tarnished for so many years, because we were not only kings and queens before we got to this country, but we were architects, mathematicians, we were diplomats, we were everything under the sun that people didn't finally accept and realize the dignity and worth of our human personality. And because of that factor, outside forces on the other side of the race decided to say, well, we couldn't keep them down during slavery. And they getting all up in it, during this period of Reconstruction. So we're going to come up with a new set of laws that we think are going to hold them back just a little bit. And those laws became eventually known as Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow still lives today, but Jim Crow doesn't wear a sheet and a hood anymore. Jim Crow wears a suit just like this. And Jim Crow has another name, James Crow Jr. Esquire. That's the name of Jim Crow's great-great-grandson in 2022. And so from that period, from 1868, going all the way through the early part of the 1900s, where we saw the rise of our people struggling still to be free. Even after the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People back in 1909, there were many mangled bodies hanging from the trees of southern states, and not just southern states, western and northern states all across the country, which reminds us, even when these rains come down and plant themselves into the soil, which causes these trees to grow, I'm reminded of Billie Holiday singing about southern trees bearing strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood on the roots, but somehow that blood that was meant to keep us back, that blood that was supposedly designed to hold us down, maturated and saturated itself into the soil around states and cities all across our country. Yes, sir. And it led us to us finally deciding we are at a period where we must straighten our back. Because Dr. King once said, a man can't ride your back unless it is bit. So men and women across this country decided it was time to stand up fully erect. It's time to get rid of the arthritis of racism, poverty, and violence. And so even in the midst of intimidation, even in the midst of bombings, even in the midst of our children and our women being raped and our children being attacked and our brothers being killed, some folks decided that enough was enough. Rosa Parks didn't just sit down on that bus in Montgomery, Alabama because she was physically tired. But Rosa Parks, on that day of December 1st, 1955, remembered that only just a couple of months earlier, in a little town called Money, Mississippi, that a 14-year-old boy from Chicago came down to see his family from the summer to never return home again, viciously killed, with his mother having to come down to identify his body and bring him back to Chicago so the world could see what happened to her boy. And that boy was named Emmett Till. So she thought about Emmett Till and not just herself on that day in Montgomery, Alabama. And because she sat down that day, a young preacher from Atlanta, Georgia, who was only 26 years old at the time, decided as she sat down, he was gonna stand up. His name was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., born out of the old Fourth Ward on 501 Auburn Avenue, that came down to a little church in Montgomery called the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and decided to say that this is a movement that has been long overdue in this country. And for 381 days, 80,000 black people in Montgomery, Alabama, worked together during weather like this. They worked together during the snowy weather of the winterous years of 1955 and 56, and they worked together during the hot, treacherous summer of 1956. And then they decided, after the Supreme Court finally decided to say, a year after the decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, that we're going to make a change and eliminate segregation on city buses. But they said, okay, now we got a seat on the bus, but that ain't enough right now. So 65 years ago, on this year, and I'm so happy to be standing as a representative on the national board of this organization, Dr. King, Ralph David Abernathy, the late Reverend Dr. Joseph Lowry, gathered at Ebenezer Baptist Church to say it's time for the preachers to come together. And as the preachers came together, came out the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, which is still active today in 2022, 65 years later, and said that we're going to tackle segregation all across the South. And we know we can't do it all in its entirety. We might have to do it piecemeal, so we might have to stop by a city down in South Georgia called Albany, because they got a little activity going down there where they're not allowing black children to access the public libraries to elevate their education in their minds. So they decided, after the white sheriff who strategically studied Dr. King and decided not to be a violent agitator, he decided to play chess with the movement. And for some days it seemed like the movement failed in Albany. But it gave rise to another spirit. That's when you started hearing songs. Instead of Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen being sung, there were newer songs being created down in Albany that said, over my head, I I see freedom in the air. And then there was another song that came out during that time, which was one of my favorite songs. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. We're gonna keep on walking. Keep on talking. Marching up the freedom land. And when they got out of Albany, they went up to Jefferson County, Alabama. Y'all might know what Jefferson County, Alabama is. That's Birmingham, Alabama. And they decided to tackle segregation, but in a different form. Because they knew where the antagonist was going to be by a white police commissioner by the name of Bull Connor. Just the name itself stated confrontation. And that's what SCLC named their direct action campaign, Confrontation C. Project C for confrontation. This is where Dr. King spent those dark 8 days in the Birmingham City Jail, where he wrote that famous jail, asking people, not just blacks, but asking those white folks who were sitting on the sidelines, knowing that there was something going wrong, saying nothing, to say that if you don't say anything, you are just as guilty as all those other folks singing dogs and water hoses on our people. And then during that time, they moved on to Washington, D.C. We all know that speech, but we all know the last part of I Have a Dream. But our power structure, they like to quote Dr. King around this time of the year, and not just around this time, but around his birthday. And they love I Have a Dream. That's probably one of the safest speeches that they can possibly quote. But they only quote the latter part of the speech because they dare not quote the first part of the speech where he talked about America giving the Negro people a bad check, a check that had come back marked insufficient funds. That check that has still caused insufficient funds in 2022. They moved from Washington, D.C. And after 100 years since the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, we got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 signed, giving us direct access to public accommodations, but we couldn't stop there. We had to go on to a little city called Selma, Alabama right after that, because there was another dog that we had to tame, and that dog was voter suppression. Don't that sound familiar? Yes, we had to tackle voter suppression because after all the strides that we had made, we still weren't able to lift our voice at the ballot box. And so, as a result of that, and as a result of all of the many acts of intimidation that were forced upon our people, the murder of a 26-year-old deacon by the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was only trying to help protect his mother from an Alabama state trooper clubbing her upside the head because she was 70-something years old, being shot point blank in the stomach. So they said enough is enough again. So the late Congressman John Lewis and another one of my personal heroes and mentors, the late great Reverend Hosea Williams, decided that we have another bridge that we must cross. This one was the Edmund Pettus Bridge. From that bridge, and just like Uncle Ed said, 54 miles later, ending at the steps of the state capitol in Montgomery, this same march that we will be recreating on next Sunday in Selma, Alabama, that's 54 miles, because we're dealing with voter suppression now in 2022. But on the steps of that Alabama Capitol in Montgomery, Dr. King asked us the question, how long? But the answer and the retort that he gave back to us said, not long. Because true pressure will rise again. Because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long. Because you shall reap what you sow. Now, as we talk about getting this house in order, I wanted to give you a little backstory about what the challenges and the call to action that we have as we leave this house of worship. Because believe it or not, as comfortable as we are in our own personal homes, as we are within our jobs, we have a great responsibility for the community at large. And that's because whatever affects the person that lives next to us can easily affect us at some point or another. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. The rich man can never be what he ought to be until the poor man is what he ought to be. John Donne caught it years ago and placed it in graphic terms. No man is an island entire itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main, and it goes on toward the end to say that any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind and therefore never seem to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. A people without a knowledge of their past is like a tree without its roots. Let me go into some housekeeping tactics for us today, since we're talking about trying to get this house in order. You know, most folks that clean up were previously known as janitors. But the term that we refer to now is custodian. But all of us that are sitting in this room are custodians of our past. We are the keepers of this present and the preservers of our future. We must keep this house in order. As long as I continue to become heart-stricken, looking at the news every day, not just around the nation, but here in the metro Atlanta area, all of these young people committing these violent acts, getting their hands on all of these firearms, left and right. Where has our village gone in 2022? It takes a village to raise a child, but when we started focusing on our own personal constraints, we forgot we must enhance and keep that village together. The same way that our grandparents and our grandparents had to do. If they saw us doing something wrong, but also not if they saw us doing something wrong, if they saw our friends doing something they had no business doing, we got to get back to the basics in 2022. I am so distraught about what I've seen in these past couple of years. We must get back to priority as custodians. It's time for us to sweep and dust in places that we tend to either overlook or we even forgot about. Because that's where most of the dirt has tended to accumulate And you know when dust settles under a rug after a certain point, or is accumulated on a fan for a certain point, once it starts blowing, it blows all that dirt and bacteria in the air, causing us to get sick. This is where infections come from. When was the last time since the year 1918 when the world had to be completely shut down due to a pandemic? And as treacherous as this pandemic was, the lives that were lost, the individuals who were stricken, myself and probably many others in this room included, this forced us to sit down, finally, after moving at a high pace for so long, to finally sit down and see where our priorities really lay. And despite of who was to blame for letting it get to the point where it is now, I think the Lord had a message for it in all of it. Because we forgot who was actually in control of this whole situation. Because we've been thinking because of our own personal prosperities and dealing with our own personal issues, we forgot who the Supreme Master was. We forgot who the Supreme Being was. But there was a part that the Lord came down to speak, to say that be still and know that I am God. And if you don't turn from your wicked ways, I will come down and break the backbone of your power. And give this land to a nation, to people who don't even know my name. We had to find out the hard way. But just like my grandmama used to say, a hard head makes a soft behind every time. So we needed that particular point. Because during this pandemic, we saw something else that we tried to ignore. And not just us in this room, but those in the greater community tried to ignore. Some folk claiming that once Barack Obama got elected president back in 2008 and inaugurated in 2009, that somehow miraculously racism in America was over. For some reason, even in the midst of what we've been trying to say all along, you don't know how hard it is or how hard it was before these incidences of 2 years ago to try to convince our folks to join organizations like SCLC and the NAACP because they thought we had arrived. I'm like, you might have thought you had arrived, but you got off at the wrong station. All right. We still have a long way to go. Our destination is quite not yet here. But we saw it. We had to sit down and look at those horrible minutes of George Floyd losing the breath out of his body. We had to sit down long enough to grieve over the tragic murder of Breonna Taylor. We had to sit down long enough to reflect, with a couple of days ago being the 10th anniversary of the death of Trayvon Martin. And then we think about Sandra Bland. We think about Tamir Rice. I could stand here all day because there's too many names to name at this point, and it's sad that we have to name all of these names. But one thing that I was proud of in 2020, when I saw folk that in no other normal circumstance would have ever participated in a march, decided that enough was enough. And we all came out collectively, even in the midst of a pandemic, even in the midst of all of us walking together like this, to say that we are tired now. We were at least 55 years during 2020 from the days of self. 65 years from the Montgomery bus boycott. After all that we have been through, the sacrifices that we made, the lives that have been lost, the bodies that have been beaten, it was sad to see that all of those 5-6 decades later, we still have to fight the same fight. But as we do, and as we think about those who had to fight harder fights before us now, those harder fights that didn't have social media outlets to cover what was going on, those harder fights to where our grandparents and our great-grandparents were sometimes scared to answer the phone or even answer the door because of a threat that somebody might have even placed a bomb in their home, or a bomb might have exploded in their church while they were only trying to do what we're doing now, worshiping together on a Sunday morning. But they continued to have the faith that the Lord will make a way somehow. I heard you, Grandmama. The Lord will make a way somehow. That even in the midst of all of the struggles that we see, the struggles that we are still continuing to go through, we still have to wear these masks for quite a while.
Oh my God.
But with all that we've got to go on, we're not going to let that stop us. Right. Everything that we are seeing within the past administration before Biden, trying to roll back the clock of progress that we worked hundreds of years to get to, but we still haven't stopped. In the midst of our young people and all of us, because I'm coming back home to get this house in order, us turning on to each other and not turning to each other. We got to deal with this crisis and this climate of violence in America, because we can't talk about white folk killing us if we're doing it our own selves to each other. Self-extermination ain't the key in 2022. Because when I think about those that died before their wish, they could have been able to go to the ballot box. Or they could have been able to at least, like an Emmett Till, be able to see an old age, but to be cut down short at 14. Trayvon at 17, Tamir Rice at the age of 12. The 4 little girls in Birmingham being struck down between the ages of 13 and 14. Their blood infuses within all of us to say that we have a greater job to do. When we leave this facility, when we leave Hands of Faith Deliverance Center on this Sunday, the last Sunday of Black History Month, we need to walk with our backs erect, our heads held high. We have a few more miles to mark. Some of us are going to be doing 54 miles next week, because as I go to a close, there are some people trying to erase the past that has so richly influenced our lives and got us to where we are today. They want to call this whole thing an argument over critical race theory. Never heard about that. And as much as I studied Black history at Morehouse, that was the first time that term had ever come up. I'm reminded when I was 7 years old, one of my favorite movies growing up was watching A Few Good Men. I don't know if y'all remember that movie. It had Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson. And Tom Cruise played a newly appointed lawyer within the Marine Corps. And he was arguing a case regarding a young recruit in the Marine Corps who was killed supposedly as a part of an initiation process. And come to find out that that colonel, played by Jack Nicholson, kind of had intel about that whole situation that took place. But while Jack Nicholson was on the stand and Tom Cruise was giving cross-examination, the debate and the argument became contentious. If you remember this movie, you remember this scene, it became one of the most dramatic highlights in Hollywood. And as Tom Cruise continued to ask questions, Jack kept seeming to get agitated at every question. But then there was one particular question that Tom Cruise asked, and that became the pinnacle of the movie. And Tom Cruise asked in a loud voice, he said, "You want answers?" Jack Nicholson asked that question, and Tom Cruise said, "I want the truth." And Jack Nicholson responded by saying, "You can't handle the truth." And that's what I want to say to America when it comes to this whole issue about our history and this whole situation with critical race theory. It's sad to say, America, you can't handle the truth. This is why we can't move forward past racism in America. Because America can't handle the truth. The crippling indignancies that America has afflicted upon us since we arrived on these shores. The horrible slavery system that it put us through. The horrible post-slavery system that is putting us through now, called the prison industrial complex, the criminal justice system, the horrible indignities that it continues to put us through with these archaic and draconian voter suppression laws that are trying to take our voice away for our people of America. You can't handle the truth. But it's time to tell the truth. Because from what I learned growing up, the truth shall set you free. And who is free shall be free indeed. So now, as we continue to go about this day, and as we move throughout this country, trying to be the custodians, the truth tellers in our society, the truth tellers and custodians for our young people coming behind us, trying to see a life that can be better and beneficial for them when they get to be our age and older. It's time for America to tell the truth. We can't move forward. I see it. I don't know if it might happen in your lifetime. I don't know if it might happen in my lifetime. We've seen quite a bit. But the possibility is there. The opportunities are endless, but America must tell the truth. That we must deal with racism by confronting the problems and just reflect on the way that America, you did this to us. And because you did this to us, there's nothing that you can do to change it at this point. But if you can acknowledge it and accept it, maybe we can move forward in our country and be able to continue to progress and to be able to bring about that beloved community that Dr. King so diligently and more fervently worked together to fight for. To bring all of us together. That's how you bring equality in this country. Because if you don't deal with the past, you really can't move forward in the future. So America, we must tell the truth. But for all of us custodians in this room today, I encourage you all. And I was so inspired, Pastor Johnson, to hear your testimony because my mother was stricken as well. She had a hard time walking at times, and there were so many times she really didn't want to get out of bed, but if there was an opportunity to come with me, to support me, whether I was speaking or school event, church, etc., she would find her way to get up and do what Lazarus did, to take up our bed and walk. And she walked with me, no matter how she was feeling. And she still walks with me now. Even after 5 years since she left this earthly life. But she stopped down within this spirit for me to tell you that even though she can't walk with me physically now, she can't walk with you physically now, but she wants all of us together to walk together, children. Walk together, children. Even in the midst of these voter suppression laws, for people that are trying to take our battle away from us because they know that our voice is our power, and our power is in that battle. The one that got Barack Hussein Obama into the White House just a few years ago. They might be trying to take that vote away from us because they see how powerful and how strong our united numbers can be, but walk together, children. Even though there are those on the outside forces trying to encourage a violent culture that is continuing to eradicate itself amongst our young people. But we know that because our young people are so strong and so smart and so powerful that they have all the resources and the intelligence necessary to circumvent all of the indignities that are trying to be presented at their feet. I say, walk together, children, as we continue to tackle all of the issues regarding our infrastructure and the houses of government. When we got individuals within states all across the country trying to take away our history, calling it divisive, calling it ways of being able to incite riots and stuff like that, where we are only enriching the minds of our youth and encouraging those who have continued to go through those times. That so-called history that brought us from a mighty, mighty long way, that history that allowed our grandparents to get on their knees to say that I will trust in the Lord. I will trust in the Lord till I die. That history that continues to say to us in 2022, walk together, children. So in spite of all of the challenges we see in America, despite all of the injustices that continue to come our way, don't despair. Don't get weary. Don't get tired. James Cleveland said, I feel no ways tired. I've come too far now from where I started from. Nobody told me that the road would be easy, but I don't believe he brought me this far to leave me. Walk together, children. We shall overcome. Walk together, children. We ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. Walk together, children. Over our head. Freedom is in the air. Walk together, children. Walk together, children. Don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land.
Jeremy Pond, SCLC.
Amen.
It's something I need him to say. Recite for me, because it just does my heart well. Just give me one minute, please. 1 minute.
April 3rd, 1968. Mason Temple Church of God in Christ in Memphis, Tennessee. 24 hours before a shot rang out at the Lorraine Motel. There was some words spoken. Nobody knew it was going to be a goodbye, but these words still rang true. And they were telling me, nah, it doesn't matter now. It really doesn't matter what happens now. I left Atlanta this morning as we got started on the plane. There were 6 of us. The pilot said over the public address system, we are sorry for the delay. But we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane. And to be sure that all of the bags were checked. And to be sure that nothing would go wrong on the plane, we had to check out everything carefully. And we had the plane protected and guarded all night. And then I got in the middle. And some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out. Oh, what would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go to the mountain. And I looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. Some have it in